And we are live. Welcome to another episode of What's New in Prisma. My name is Nicholas, and I'm here with my colleague Ryan.
Hey, how's it going? Today, Nicholas, you're looking very orange right now.
Yes, well, I am in a new room today. The room is called Bacon. We'll talk about this in a second. And hopefully you also notice that the audio quality today is a little bit better than the last couple of times that we spoke here. That's just because I'm actually speaking right into the microphone this time. So I think this already increases the quality, of course. But we'll also actually turn this room that I'm in right now into a sort of studio. So in the future, hopefully the quality, the video and audio quality, hopefully is going to improve here.
Sounding good, man. I think it's already a big improvement. So that's awesome.
Cool. Yeah, and speaking of rooms, I mean, you haven't visited us here yet in the office in Berlin, but we actually have like a naming scheme for all of our rooms here. And that naming scheme is basically that we pick names according to emojis that can be eaten. So we have a room called coconut, a room called avocado, and the room that I'm in here right now, it's called bacon.
Yummy. And you got something special in that room, hey? Something very appetizing.
So to identify each of the rooms, we actually have like small hints in the rooms that show you which room you're in at the moment. And in this room, we actually have 3 hints, although it's kind of the smallest one. It's actually just a 1-person room. But here is a little pig. That's kind of the pre-bacon stage. Then we have an actual kind of bacon made out of cloth. And finally, we also have a bacon candle. And that's probably kind of the...
Have you lit that candle? I can't imagine it smells good at all.
Nobody dared lighting it yet.
No one has dared.
Well, I smelled it once. I actually smell it right now just from opening it. And it's, yeah, I don't want to lit it. We'll just leave it at this, I think.
Not good, eh? Oh, man.
All right. Cool. Ryan, you are in Canada. You're not in the office here. And on Tuesday, you missed a really nice barbecue that you had.
I'm jealous of the barbecue you had.
Yeah, we actually have a couple of remotees here in the company, and we did dial a few of them in. So we had a Zoom meeting, we had a laptop that we just put across the table so that everybody could join and kind of watch us have the barbecue. And one thing that I wanted to point out, and that makes me just make me jump straight into sharing my screen today. So let's start with this. I'm going to share my screen up here. So one thing that I want to show regarding the barbecue is that we actually have a chef here at the company. And you might already know him from a couple of live streams that he did where he showed you a few delicious recipes with Prisma and Happy.js. I'm speaking, of course, about my colleague Daniel. And we have a couple of pictures from his work during the barbecue. So this is Daniel when he's not live streaming and explaining to you how to build and deploy applications with Prisma. But that's him when he's cooking really, really good meat at the barbecue. And here is even a close-up of the same pig. All right, I think that's enough talking about food for today, and I think we can transition to speaking about the latest Prisma release.
2.7.
Yes, that was the 2.7 release that we released on Tuesday this week. So again, we were on time. And in this one, the biggest and I think most exciting new thing is that we were finally able to release Prisma Studio out of its experimental state. So it is now stable, and that also means that when you want to use Studio, that you can just start it with npx Prisma Studio and sparing the experimental flag that was required before. Have you used Studio a lot, Ryan, or is that something that where you're still like fairly new at the company? So like I bet you haven't explored all of the different parts of Prisma yet, even, right?
That is right. I am continually uncovering new parts of Prisma that are awesome and exciting to use. With Studio, I have given it I've kicked the tires with it, as it were, but I have not given it like a really good spin. But as opposed to using something like Table Plus, which I use as my, just general database table editor, viewer, etc. I think I'm going to start to really default to Prisma Studio in the demos that I'm doing. As I'm working on Prisma data models and I'm wanting to see the data live, I'm gonna spin up Studio instead and give that a proper go. Especially now that it's out of experimental, I think it's a good choice over kind of a conventional table viewer. And I think you've mentioned that it gives you some nice features that you wouldn't maybe get in a table viewer that are particular to Prisma. Maybe do you want to chat about some of those? I think it's something about relations, right?
Yes, absolutely. And so as a quick side note, if you currently don't have a Prisma project on your computer, but you still want to explore how Studio works, you can just go to the domain prisma.studio, where we have a couple of read-only demos prepared for you. And here I'm going to use the Chinook database, which is just a database with a couple of different tables, really. Album, artist, customer, employee, genre, invoice. So sort of like a music application domain, basically. And we'll now explore a little bit how you can use Prisma Studio to view the data and explore a couple of more features that Prisma Studio gives you. So, of course, first and foremost, we have a pretty standard kind of table view that you would expect, that you probably also find in a lot of other database GUIs. But what I really like about Studio is that it really is a modern GUI for your database. I always feel that these traditional database GUIs, they always feel a little bit clunky, and also kind of the level of abstraction that they provide. I mean, of course, they are just like representing the SQL tables directly. But what happens when you're using Studio is that you actually see the Prisma models here. So however you configured your Prisma models, this is what you'll have access to through the Prisma Studio viewer as well. A couple of features. So you can set filters for your tables here. So if you wanted to only see, for example, an artist with a, like where the name contains the letter A, then you can just do this. Let's see if there is one that has AB. So we indeed have like a couple of artists that have this somewhere an AB inside of their name. You can also decide which fields you want to display here. So I could now remove the ID field, for example, and it will only show the columns that are relevant for me at this point. And you can also paginate. So in this case, we are showing all three results, but I could also say that I just want to show one result, for example, or if I want to skip one even and just show the second one, then this would work as well. So that's how you use Studio on a very basic level. And then indeed, you hinted at it already. I think one really, really cool feature of Studio is actually the way how it lets you work with relations. So here from artist, we have a relation to the album model. And apparently this artist, AC/DC, is connected to two albums that we have in the database. So if I click on this, I basically now see an entire the entire table with all the album records, and the ones that belong to AC/DC are selected right here. So I could now go and manipulate the data right here in Studio. And of course, this is not going to work in this case because this is a read-only demo that I'm looking at here. But this is basically how you would manipulate the data inside of your database, that you can change it. I could also do the same here, by the way, and then just click the save button to persist the changes in the database.
That's awesome. One thing that comes to mind with Studio, and maybe some other people are wondering this. Do you know if there's any kind of like upper limit to the number of records you can show? Because I mean, one issue when viewing this kind of stuff in the browser is that you're going to run up against browser limitations about how many DOM nodes you can populate into the page, etc. Have we come up against any sort of upper limits in terms of data that can be displayed at a given time?
That's a really good question, and I am not aware of any concrete limits there, to be honest. But what I know is that Sid, the developer who has been primarily working on Studio, he has especially put a lot of effort recently into improving performance. That was kind of one of the last big things that we needed to get right before we could release Studio out of its experimental state. So I'm pretty sure that you probably can display probably even like to the thousands of records here in the browser, where you can just scroll and it shouldn't be laggy in any way. So cool. I'm like fairly confident that this works even with fairly big data sets.
Awesome. That's great. Yeah, I'm going to explore it a lot more. So thank you for that tour.
All right. And then I quickly want to talk about the second big improvement in this release. And that is that you can now configure the location of your Prisma schema file in your package.json. So if you're a rebel, or if you just want to do something that is just unconventional, you might go and not call your Prisma folder Prisma, but instead you might want to call it database or whatever else. And because the Prisma CLI, when you invoke a command like Prisma introspect or Prisma generate, the first thing that the CLI typically does is it's going to look for the location, or it's going to look for your Prisma schema. And by default, it's looking in the current directory or in a directory that's called Prisma. So let's actually test this right here. This is the script example that I just from the Prisma examples repo that I cloned from there. And if I now would want to run the Prisma generate command like this, then the CLI would fail because it cannot find the Prisma schema file, which it expects to be by default in the current directory, so somewhere on that level as all the other files here, or it would expect it to be located in a folder called Prisma, which is the default name for the folder with your Prisma configuration. So if that's not the case, what you could have done, or like what you were able to do in previous versions of Prisma, you could have provided the schema flag to the CLI command and then just point it to the actual schema file. So this would indeed work. But if you always have to do this, it kind of gets a little bit annoying, and you probably want to have a more convenient way to configure the location of your Prisma schema file. So what we now introduce is that you can provide the location by default via your package.json. You just add a property that's called Prisma, and in there you add another property that's called schema, and then you just provide the path to the schema.prisma file. And now with this change in my package.json, I can go ahead and just invoke the Prisma generate command without the schema flag, and it's still going to work. So that's also new in the latest Prisma 2.7 version that we released on Tuesday.
Very cool. Is there anything else that we support in that Prisma property in the package.json aside from schema? Is there any other utility that can go in there?
Not yet, I believe. I'm not aware of anything else, but I think this is now a great start to see where else we can provide convenience for developers that want to spare some sort of manual configuration every time they invoke the CLI, and just provide that kind of configuration directly in the package.json, which is a file that every Node.js project will have by default, right? So it's really a good kind of place to put that kind of configuration.
Yeah, and it's a nice thing too, because like with tools like Prettier, for example, it's nice to have that configuration right in your package.json file so that when you are working with other developers, they get the same config right out of the box, right? So that you don't have to have them worry about configuring like some config files in their workspace or whatever. It's all just kind of, everyone has the same config if you put it into package.json. So that's interesting. I'm curious to see where else we can go with that config option there. That's really cool. So should we talk about some of the community stuff that has popped up in recent times,
Yes,
namely this
absolutely.
UML generator. So Prisma has this concept of generators, which you can, Prisma's got tools that can allow you to tap into your Prisma model to do various things. And so we see some of these things in action in various ways. If you want to generate, like a GraphQL CRUD API, for example, we've seen stuff like this. One that we saw this week, a community thing, I'm going to share my screen here so that we can get a look at it, is called Prisma UML. So here's my screen. Looks like it's popping up there. That's good. Prisma UML. This is it here. So this is the author, Jan, and you can find Prisma UML here at this GitHub link. So what does this do? UML is universal. What is it? Modeling language? Is that UML? Universal modeling language, I believe, right? And so
yes, and I just want to quickly interrupt you. Sorry, Ryan.
Sure.
There were actually two tools this week that have been released, and the one that you're now talking about is the one that's called Prisma UML. That's a CLI, and then there also was a generator that translates into DBML. That's also that can be invoked via a Prisma generator in the Prisma schema. So these are two different tools, and we'll talk about the other one, the DBML tool. We'll talk about that in the next stream. Today, we're introducing the Prisma UML package.
Yep, Prisma UML. Yeah, good call. Prisma UML is going to give a universal modeling language diagram of your database model. So it's something I'm sure have seen before if you're working with databases. I wonder if there's even a screenshot of what I'm talking about when I talk about UML. Maybe not in here, but there was a link to Plant UML. And I think this is going to give basically an idea of what we're talking about. So, you've probably seen UML diagrams before. It talks about like how your database tables map together, etc. And it's a language which you can, so you can think about, like Markdown. Markdown converts to HTML and renders as HTML. You supply some UML here, it's going to render a diagram for you, basically. So this is a tool built to generate UML from your Prisma model, which is really cool. So let's take a look at how this would work here. I'm going to go into this model that I've got. This is kind of maybe a more complex model that I was working on. Complex in the way that I've got like a many-to-many relationship here. And I was working on this recently for a live stream that I did for Redwood. I think this is a good one that we can demo this on. So according to the docs here, the way that you get this going is you can either do npx Prisma UML to if you don't want to install this globally, but I've installed it globally. And so that's, just npm install globally Prisma UML. And then you can do Prisma UML -- help. See what commands you get. So you can get a UML from your schema. You can get a diagram output to SVG, to PNG, etc. So why don't we see if we can just get the actual UML, so the markup. So let's do Prisma UML. And I'm going to go into where my schema is. Right now, it's under this API directory and then in the Prisma directory. So we'll say that it's going to be at API Prisma and schema.prisma. If I do that, here's what I get. I get an output basically of UML. So I can copy this if I wanted to. I can just go like this, go to the start, hit copy. and then come over here to this plant UML viewer, and I can paste that in and submit it. And when I do, I get my UML diagram, just like that. So very cool. It shows the relationships between tables, it shows the properties within, etc. And then the other cool thing is that I can actually get that done for me if I do -- output to say PNG, and I need to give it a file name. I just want to double check the command that -- file will give this to me right here, test uml.png. Hopefully this works. Let's see. Yeah, it's successfully created and should be down here. There it is.
That's amazing.
So, yeah, really cool. It's output directly for you.
And if I'm not mistaken, this also means that Prisma is now enterprise ready.
Exactly. If we're doing UML diagrams, I mean, that's what you wanted, an enterprise stage, right? So perfect. Exactly. Ship it. So yeah, this is it's a cool example though. I think what Niko and I wanted to highlight today is like, it's a cool example of how Prisma gives these extensibility points that you can tap into to do cool stuff like this. And I was looking through like how this is done, because I wasn't too familiar with how you would work with a CLI like this. And the key to it, the crux of it, is if you go into core here and then into Prisma to plant UML, it's all working on this get DMMF function that comes from the Prisma SDK. This is what's used to basically get the information that is then kind of iterated over to generate these diagrams. And we can get a sense of that actually if we come over here. I've got this other demo. I've just pulled up these recent demos that I've done that have data models for me. I've got this function that allows me to do some async stuff where I am going to await that get DMMF function, passing in a data model path, which points to my Prisma model. And I just want to see what's in there. So npm run dev to get a look at that. And when I do, we get this, a bunch of stuff. So I don't know if you would call this an AST necessarily, but like it reminds me of when you would work with ASTs, like you know, I'm thinking of like in GraphQL specifically, like you would use the info object in your resolvers to get a GraphQL AST, and you can use that to do all sorts of cool stuff. It gives you information about your query. And in the same way, we're given information through the DMMF about our Prisma model. And this is like the raw info about it. So you can use this info now to go and do whatever. And everything's collapsed in here, just the way that it's coming onto the screen. But if we do something like this, we can get a sense of like how big this thing is.
Yeah, there's a lot of info in there.
To do that, this thing is pretty large. Like there's a lot going on here. You basically get like all of the information about your model in like an AST form. You can run with this and do all sorts of cool stuff. So this is what's used to generate that UML essentially. And one thing I was wondering, Niko, maybe you know, is what does DMMF stand for? Data model something is what I would anticipate, but what's the other MF here?
Exactly, that's the data model meta format.
Meta format.
Exactly, you explained it perfectly right, Ryan. That's basically the internal structure that we are using internally whenever we need to parse the Prisma schema and do anything with it, really. So a lot of the Prisma CLI commands are depending on the DMMF, but also, as we talked about last time, for example, the type GraphQL CRUD generator that we talked about, that you can insert into your Prisma schema as well, that also reads the DMMF and based on that generates some other code, right? So the DMMF really is the core of everything, like everything else that is falling out of the Prisma schema in the end. And that's the relevant part for library authors. So whoever has an idea for what they want to do with the Prisma schema, because they think it's a nice way of modeling data, and they can just kind of pick it up and turn the Prisma models into whatever else really that they want, right? A couple of streams ago, we talked about a community project from our colleague Harshit, actually, who built a tool that would generate you individual API reference documentation for your Prisma project. That's also based on these internals that you can find inside of the Prisma SDK. And also the generator that we are going to talk about next time, the DBML one, that's also depending on that. So it's really that internal structure that people can read in order to kind of transform and generate whatever other thing they want to have from the Prisma schema. Very nice demo, Ryan.
Yeah, I thought it was really cool. And the DBML generator is something that we'll also talk about. And we could even did you want to show something on it today? We could even pop up like the page just to show how it looks when you're integrating it into your project. Do you think it's worthwhile to do that now, or should we wait till next stream?
Yeah, I think we'll spare that for next time, actually.
Cool. That sounds good. Yeah, and something that we were talking about is like we're wondering what are some other possibilities of working with generators? Like when would these come into play? Like what kind of cool things could be done, or what are some concrete needs that people might have for generators? And so if you have any ideas for that, feel free to throw them in the comments. But have you had any thoughts, Niko, on what like makes sense to exist out in the wild that maybe isn't there yet, that would rely on generators?
So I have at least one idea that also is basically born out of a feature request that somebody asked on Slack the other day. So we had a person who basically didn't really need the Prisma client API to read and write data in their database. So they didn't care that much about having find many, find one, create operations. But what they just cared about were to get TypeScript types for their Prisma models. So this would also be a really good use case for a generator that you could use inside of the Prisma schema. And just include that, and then you could generate the TypeScript types based out of that. So that would be an interesting use case. Another interesting one, and I'm pretty excited about this one, actually. I'll share a link to this in the comments real quick. It's from a GitHub discussion where somebody just out of the blue basically raised the question about the Prisma internals as well. And the reason why they were doing that was because they were also writing their own custom generator to generate deploy-ready code to deploy a GraphQL API with AWS Amplify. So they basically take the Prisma schema and they take that as foundation, and then they generate code that they can deploy to AWS Amplify, which I think is a fairly exotic use case, but also a really interesting one. And it kind of shows the power and the flexibility of the Prisma modeling language that we've come up with here.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's awesome. I'm excited about the possibilities here. I want to explore more.
All right. We don't have too many other things to talk about today, so maybe we can pick up a couple of more questions in the end. So people watching this, if you have any questions on mind that you always wanted to ask, then now is already a good time to drop them into the chat. And I'm going to quickly continue with a short promotion here. We haven't talked about it on the stream yet, Ryan, but we have started a big effort recently, actually, internally, where we want to educate developers about working with databases. And that's not necessarily even related to using Prisma, but really just general database content that's relevant for developers. So what we came up with is the Prisma Data Guide. And you can just find that on our website. At the moment, it's located at dataguide.prisma.io. And it really starts with all the fundamentals that you would want to know as a developer when you're getting started with databases. And maybe you don't even know what a database is or how it actually works. So we really go very, very deep here in these articles and explain all the theoretical foundations and include a lot of also practical knowledge and practical tips for developers who are working with databases. So we have this initial section, which is just basically an introduction, general introduction to databases, what they are, comparing different database types. This one I think is especially interesting. So we're talking about kind of legacy databases. What was there even before relational databases were introduced, and other more kind of the database types that were developed really early. And then we talk about relational databases, NoSQL databases, NewSQL, and multi-model databases. So really a tour through all the different database types in existence, basically. I also want to highlight the data modeling chapter that we have online. This is written by Diane Fay. She's actually the author of Massive.js, which is a really nice library to also access your database. So you should check that out as well. And we're also talking about a couple of more other topics. So here we have a comparison article that just compares kind of the levels of abstractions for different ways to talk to your database, starting from plain SQL over query builders to higher level ORMs. And then we have focused a lot on Postgres recently. So if you're a Postgres user, then this is definitely worth a look, where you can just explore a couple of features, or if you want to learn about specific topics like authentication and authorization in Postgres, then these articles will be for you.
Very cool.
All right. I don't think we have too much else to talk about, but one thing I think that I want to close with is that we want to encourage our community members, so probably everybody who is watching right now, to maybe go and create content about Prisma. And this is really something where I think you have a lot of experience with, Ryan. Like, what's your kind of experience as a content creator? How do you kind of select topics? And one question I think that's also commonly asked is, or where people aren't sure if they are even the right people to create content, especially if you're maybe a newcomer to Prisma or even a programming beginner. Like, is that even a good spot for you to start creating content, or should you rather maybe wait until you're really familiar with a specific technology before you kind of write your first tutorial or your first blog article about it?
I think it's super valuable to not wait until you are well-versed with the technology. And it might seem a little bit paradoxical at first, but the reason I think it's a good idea to write content before you even feel ready to do so is because it will help you learn. That's one thing. When you have to reiterate what you've learned in the form of writing and examples in a way that other people can understand, that's a very good way to cement your own knowledge. So that has worked very well for me when I've been learning new topics, and I go and create a blog post about it and come up with examples. It requires that you really understand what you're talking about before you can come to the place where you can explain it well. And so that whole process of being able to explain it is going to cement your knowledge. So it's very useful that way. And the other thing I would say about that is, you're in a great position if you are a newcomer, if you are just starting out, to be able to offer like real tangible value to others, because once you get past a certain point of, call it expertise or domain knowledge or whatever, you kind of become blind to the things that are not apparent to other newcomers. And so, whereas if you have a ton of knowledge about a domain and you go off and you create a big technical article about it, in that scenario, you might be missing a whole swath of people that don't yet have those foundational skills or foundational pieces of knowledge to be able to understand what you're talking about. So when you are just starting out, you've got this ability, this unique ability, I think, to be able to craft content in a way that other newcomers can understand it, because you are there yourself. So I think it's very important, actually, if you're a newcomer, to do content if it's something that you want to do. And I think it's a great way to cement your knowledge and also to add value to the community. So I would say find a problem that you want to solve. That's a good way to start, and write about your experience with it. So if you are, thinking about doing something with the DMMF and you are thinking about writing some kind of generator, a good place to start there is, like, if you have to solve your own problem using a generator, And now you've got to go learn about how the DMF works, document your steps, and talk about what you went through. And that's going to help a lot of people figure the same things out when it comes time for them to do so.
Very spot on. I really like what you said there, Ryan. And I think it reminds me a little bit of a quote that I heard at a conference talk, and it actually stuck with me. It was a conference talk that I already attended, I think 2013 or 2014 was one of my first developer conferences, actually, where it was somebody, I think, from the iOS community, which is kind of my root as a developer. Actually, I started like programming as an iOS developer, and it was I think Ash Furrow back then, who's very prominent in the iOS community, who said that as a newcomer or as a as somebody who is learning something, you're kind of uniquely qualified to explain the topic, because you still remember what it feels like to not understand the thing, and you can clearly articulate that transition from not understanding to understanding. So that really stuck with me, that idea of being able to find the right words, because you're still in both mindsets, right? You still remember, this is what it feels like when I don't understand it, but this is what it feels like when I do understand it. But how do I get from here to there? Well, this is now your task as the person who just learned it to put that down and bring that into words.
Yeah,
I can definitely +1 this. And one thing that I also want to mention in that context is the Learn in Public hashtag that Sean created, Swix on Twitter. A couple of people probably know him already. He's a really big advocate of this idea of learning in public and just going out and putting yourself out there, sharing your knowledge and sharing what you learned, so that you benefit from it, but also so that the community benefits from it. And if you need a little bit of inspiration for where to start, I have a couple of ideas. For example, one question that's repeatedly brought up on our Slack is that people want to learn how to implement GraphQL subscriptions, so real-time functionality with Prisma. Because as a lot of you are going to know, that with Prisma 2, we don't really have a native GraphQL layer in Prisma anymore. So in Prisma 1, we had this native support for real-time and GraphQL subscriptions that we don't have anymore in Prisma 2. So a lot of people keep asking, how do I now do this with Prisma 2? And in fact, there are a couple of different ways how you can implement subscriptions with Prisma, and they all are they all have their own kind of use cases and benefits. And the first one that I quickly just want to show, I prepared a example that you can actually also find in the Prisma examples repo, which is just my go-to whenever I need some kind of straightforward way to use Prisma in a specific context. So here we have this GraphQL subscriptions example, subscriptions pub/sub it's called, and I already cloned the repo and have it here on my machine. And here I just quickly want to show you the mechanism that is used to implement subscriptions here. So the way how that works is actually that you manually trigger a subscription in your mutation resolvers. So mutations are the operations in GraphQL that cause some kind of side effects on the backend. And this is typically also when you want to send out kind of notifications to clients that are interested in these kinds of events. So in this case—
One thing, Niko, are you wanting to share your screen? You're not right now, if you were wanting to share.
Thank you for letting me know, because I thought I was sharing. Here you go. There is my screen. Sorry, you were also missing out on the Learn in Public hashtag that I showed on my own screen without anybody else seeing it, and the profile of Sean here as well. So if you want to look that up, that's what Learn in Public is about. But I was talking about the subscriptions pub/sub example that you can find in the Prisma examples repo, and I have it here locally on my machine. And the way how it's being set up is that you have this pub/sub object that you're getting from Apollo Server, but actually Apollo Server is just bundling it. Originally, it comes from the GraphQL subscriptions package. So if you're not using Apollo Server, but another GraphQL server such as express GraphQL, for example, then you could just use the GraphQL subscriptions package directly and import PubSub from there. Here we're using Apollo server, so we can import it from there. And here is now how you can use this. So here we have our mutation resolvers, and basically just what you need to do is you, well, actually I should start here. I should start where you define the actual subscription yourself, the subscription type. So in this case, we are defining one subscription that's called latest post. And it's also implemented with the PubSub that is being, with the PubSub object that is being attached to the context right here. And for those of you who have no idea what subscriptions actually are and what they look like, I can give a very quick demo of that. So I'm going to start here, increase the font a bit. So that subscriptions type that is being defined here, and that's called, that has one field that's called latest posts. That you can also see here. So the fact that we are defining this, I want it, or was it? No, that's still the old one, sorry. Yes. So this latest post field here is defined right here, and it's of type post, and that's what we see in the GraphQL schema right here. If we now wanted to use that subscription and listen for the latest post event, we can just write a subscription in the same syntax that we're already used to from queries and mutations. We can also ask for the fields that should be provided upon each event. And then I can click the play button in the playground. But unlike for queries and mutations, this is not going to resolve immediately, but it's just going to start listening for events that are happening. And these events can now be triggered with this context.pubsub.publish function that you can invoke. You have to pass the name of the event, so of the subscription field, in order to associate it with that. And the data that's being returned from here will also be the data, or actually the data, yeah, I guess that's the one that's the payload here, and that's also the post right here. So if I now were to send this mutation, then we see that we receive an event here, and it still keeps listening. So if I wanted to have a new event with another random title, I can just go ahead, and these are going to pop up here. So subscriptions are a mechanism that allow developers to just listen for events with GraphQL. And a lot of people are wondering, how do they implement that on the server side with Prisma? Well, here is how. This is one way of doing this. But you can also trigger this pubsub.publish thing. You can trigger that also in basically in other contexts. So you could also use the recently introduced use function, the middleware function of Prisma Client, to trigger these kinds of events. And instead of triggering it inside of a mutation resolver, you could configure the prisma.use function. Let's see, where do I have my Prisma Client? You could do something like this. Use, and here basically you would provide a function that's called upon specific Prisma Client queries, and that's where you would then invoke or push to the PubSub object, basically. And the third option is that you could also just implement this based on native database triggers. So if you don't want to trigger the subscriptions based on events that are happening in your application code, but rather based on events that are happening in your database, you can also configure native database triggers with SQL and catch those in your application code, and then again push to this PubSub object right here. That's one thing that's very commonly requested by our community, and other ideas would be, or things that are commonly requested are how to build kind of a relay frontend with a Prisma backend. Again, that's kind of these two things, they don't directly like they don't directly interface with each other because you have the GraphQL layer in between, and Relay really just cares about talking to GraphQL and doesn't really care about what's behind GraphQL. In this case, that's Prisma, but it could be any other database access mechanism, basically. So yeah, you have these three ways, and you could also write a tutorial about Relay with GraphQL. If you want to do that, we are happy to help you promote your content. So feel free to reach out to us, and we can see if we can maybe help you promote it on Twitter with a retweet or something like this. I think we are fairly flexible in that regard.
For sure. And if anyone is wanting to do content and wants feedback on your, your drafts or what you've put out there, please feel free to hit any of us up on that. We'd be happy to help you, with some of the more, I guess, just meta things about content, the way that it's written or the way it's recorded, etc. We'd be happy to help with that as well.
Okay.
Cool.
All right.
That's all we got, hey?
Yeah, I think we're coming to the end. Were there any questions in the chat? It seems like people were eager to comment, but not a lot of questions as of today.
Yeah, I guess the only concrete one is, did we phase out Prisma Cloud? And
yes.
Maybe, and maybe you could just even touch on like the heart of this question coming from Prisma 1, and I'm not super familiar with what the offering was at Prisma 1, but maybe you could just for those who don't know, kind of touch on that.
Yes, very happy about this question actually, and about the opportunity to clarify here. So what Prisma Cloud actually is, was a web API or just like web GUI basically that would help you host and manage your Prisma 1 server. So really what Prisma Cloud was all about, it was about helping you with the kind of monitoring, setup, configuration of your Prisma 1 server. As you know, Ryan, once we released Prisma 2, we kind of got rid of this extra standalone Prisma server component that people have to host themselves even. So there is no Prisma server anymore that people could be hosting with Prisma Cloud. So in that sense, the entire purpose of what Prisma Cloud used to be is now obsolete because the Prisma server doesn't exist anymore. So in that sense, we also don't have a current offering for Prisma Cloud that would relate to Prisma 2 in any way. So Prisma Cloud, as it stands now, is just a way to help you with your Prisma 1 server, and therefore it's really only related to Prisma 1. In Prisma 2, we don't have an equivalent for that yet, and there also is no need for an equivalent because there is no Prisma server anymore.
Yep, good call. Yeah, I think that's the only question that we've got, really.
Yes.
Yeah, so if you have more questions next time, feel free to put them in. And next one will be in 2 weeks, around at the same time on the same day 2 weeks from now.
Yes, exactly. Looking forward to see you then again, Ryan.
Absolutely. All right.
Have a nice one. Bye.
Bye-bye.